Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. Today we're recording on the afternoon of Monday, the 25th of November. Hey Jen, how are things? What's been keeping you busy?
Hey Richard, how are you? Lots happening in the world, not necessarily lots of good things, but lots of things happening and lots happening in the maritime domain. For me, what's been keeping me busy, I've had three pieces that will be published very, very shortly. One that was published last week, which I think we'll get into, which is my paper entitled Time for a Coastguard, published with the Australian Naval Institute. We'll put a link in the show notes, which is kind of making what is not a new argument, but it certainly hasn't been a discussion in a long time now about what are our appropriate maritime security structures within Australia, and kind of highlight some gaps with our maritime security structures. But I think we'll talk about that a little bit more. I've just finished a piece completely out of the maritime domain, but our listeners might find it of interest on defence export control regimes and how they've changed under AUKUS, what that means and where the gaps still are. So that'll be published in the Exports Control Australia group publication coming out in a couple of weeks, and we'll share a link to the show note at the time. And then I do have more maritime related, a piece coming out with the Australian Army Research Council this week on a book review on a book called 21st Century Mahan, which is effectively a book that looks at some of the essays that Mahan has written. So obviously we talk about Mahan's kind of seminal work, but he actually did a lot of other things which are actually much more readable than the work we quote from him. So it talks about how it's worthwhile reading these essays. My favourite one is the essay on naval administration and how the bureaucracy can take over in terms of control and often de-emphasising operations, which I think is a really important conversation right now in terms of the structure of the Department of Defence. But that is me. What about you, Richard? What have you been up to?
Well, I'm glad that BJ's 21st Century Mahan's got a mention on here. It's sat on my shelf somewhere over there, actually. So if you get a chance, do read it. It's excellent. What have I been up to? Not a huge amount. The main thing I've been doing, hopefully there'll be something out relatively soon from me on stuffed ships taken up from trade and talking about the role it's played in facilitating Australian military operations and the challenges that might be facing Australia if they have to rely on that capability again and the likelihood of so doing. So that hopefully will be out sometime later this month, so we'll see.
I'm excited about that. But isn't the Maritime Strategic Fleet going to solve all these problems?
All of them.
All of them.
All three ships, right? It's going to solve all of our problems.
$21 million and the 3 training bunks a year.
Absolutely. The cynicism I can hear dripping from your voice. Anyway, we want to talk a little bit to unpack a bit more about your Coastguard paper. So, do you want to give us the lowdown on what you're arguing and why you think it is that we need to explore the option of a Coastguard again?
Absolutely. So I think there's a couple of elements of it. One of the things that's kind of struck me over the last 4 years is once the Defence Strategic Update came out in 2020, it talked about the removal of strategic warning time. Now, that means a whole bunch of different things in force design parlance. But the conversation since that has always been about capability and about increasing workforce. It hasn't really been about the Defence Forces or the wider Australian national security architecture's capacity to deal with what is changing in the environment. And I think when you talk about the issue of capacity, there are other elements, including structure, processes, etc., that we're not really talking about. From a structural element, I think there's a real gap in Australia's maritime security architecture. We tend to bifurcate the concepts of civil maritime security and military maritime security, and we see that in the strategy. So we have a civil maritime security strategy that excludes issues of military considerations, search and rescue, because that's AMSA, it's not Home Affairs. It excludes subsea cables. The word subsea cable or undersea cable is not mentioned in it. It excludes pollution and a bunch of other things. I think one of the reasons for this is because we have so many organisations that are responsible for maritime security in Australia. So if you read the Guide to Australian Maritime Security Arrangements, there's about 30 organisations, right? It is. Check it out. It'll put you to sleep if you're having sleeping problems. But there's about 30 organisations that deal with maritime security, right? And so I think that when we looked at this in the early 2000s, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, where we had quite a focus on the impacts of maritime terrorism, which was thought to be the next wave of terrorism that didn't really manifest, we came up with a structure called Maritime Border Command, which sits under the Department of Home Affairs. But it is really a coordination agency. It doesn't actually have people or assets. So it relies on people and assets from a range of different agencies, but predominantly the Australian Defence Force and the Australian Border Force Maritime Unit. What that means is that Defence is actually feeling a lot of the burden for the constabulary or maritime law enforcement operations. So all of the Navy's patrol boat force, really all they do is Maritime Border Command operations, right? What we've also learned after the last 2 decades is every annual report from Home Affairs, you bury down in the numbers, says that the Australian Border Force Maritime Unit, which is only about 550 people, right? We have the third largest exclusive economic zone in the world. Our maritime domain is bigger than our landmass. Now, Border Force Maritime Unit is about 550 people, has about 11 patrol vessels plus one kind of large haulage vessel and a couple of fast attack craft, and it leases aircraft. Every year we see in the annual reporting and centre estimates that it doesn't meet its government-directed targets for sea patrol days or aerial surveillance, by and large, right? And I think a lot of that is just structural. It does not have the correct structure to meet the requirements, which means Defence picks up the burden, often with expensive P8s or warships or amphibious ships. All this is happening whilst maritime security threats are changing. So we saw subsea cables, which we'll talk about more, attacking Europe again in the last week. We have seen Russia use migration against Finnish borders, etc., as a hybrid method of warfare or grey zone operations. I know the two are not quite the same, but we won't get into that here. We're seeing China weaponising not only their maritime militia in South China Sea, but also long-range fishing fleets. So we're seeing the blurring of what is civil and what is a military maritime security threat. So our paper kind of makes the argument that, hey, we gave that structure a good go. It was developed in the early 2000s in a completely different strategic environment. It hasn't worked. It's relying too much on the Defence Force. The DSR and the NDS say the Defence Force needs to be focused on high-end warfighting. Meanwhile, the maritime security threats are evolving and becoming more complex. So for those reasons, I say it's time to revisit the conversation about a more professionalised, and I mean no disrespect to the hard-working women and men of the ABF Maritime Unit, who are simply just not resourced for this, professionalised paramilitary Coastguard to look after some of that maritime home defence, so maritime law enforcement, but also port protection, etc., freeing up the capacity of the ADF. So that's the broad argument of the paper, that 2 decades on from what was the Tonkin Review, which occurred in 2004, which is a classified review. We only know some stuff in the public that it happened and that it recommended Maritime Border Command. We really need to revisit this. And my biggest concern is that the structural elements of our national security architecture won't be revisited until there's a crisis, and that's too late.
Are
you sold? Are you buying a ticket to the Australian Coast Guard now?
I'm certainly sold on the need for a debate. And I think it's a really interesting kind of question. And I find some of the Australian maritime security arrangements, frankly, bizarre. And also the way they've grown up at a time when the whole part of the point of maritime security as a concept, as an idea, is to actually draw lots of these things together. But at the same time, a lot of the arrangements have then tried to pull them back apart again, which is a slightly odd dynamic. But I know that there's, and I'm sure you've had sort of pushback around this sort of question about, well, at the time when we're desperately trying to focus on high-end sort of peer threats, high-end warfare, is now the time to be going back and doing something that has an air of the early 2000s about it. But I think that it's certainly a really interesting conversation. And it's Coast Guards are very much the flavour of the era and the region. if not necessarily used purely on what Jeff Till would describe as the home game, but also on the away game, the ability to engage in Coastguard to Coastguard diplomacy, or even potentially counter some of the lawfare type aspects of the use of coastguards that we've seen quite a lot in this region. So it's certainly a really interesting debate, and I think a useful contribution to try and kickstart that. We'll have to see whether or not anyone jumps on the bandwagon.
Well, on the discussion, keep an eye out for an upcoming Defence Connect podcast. I know I'm always advertising other podcasts on this podcast. Defence Connect podcast with Steve Cooper unpacking it, and also a SimSec podcast with Jonathan Stelling in the SimSec in the US think tank, also unpacking it. I guess on your point about high-end warfare, I agree, right? There's a point of how much change do you do at one time. But actually, when you look at the elements of the ADF that actually support Maritime Border Command, they're actually meant to be discrete, kind of contained elements, and I think you could do it. And actually, it might open up a whole bunch of opportunities in terms of workforce, in terms of the reserves, and free up some of those challenges. And certainly, anyone who's ever been a career manager in Navy career management would understand the pain of trying to convince someone who wants to serve on patrol boats in Darwin to come back and do warfare course. So there are some bits in it, but we won't take up the whole episode.
No.
Given that I've just said there's 2 other podcasts coming out talking about a Coast Guard. What else is happening, Richard?
So we've already flagged it briefly, but there was another incident in Europe about critical maritime infrastructure, undersea infrastructure. As so often with these kind of things, the details are a little bit blurry, and trying to work out quite what's happened and who's done what, when, where is a real challenge. What we do know is that over the period between the 17th and the 18th European time, 2 cables were damaged, one between Finland and Germany and the other between Sweden and Lithuania. These have been described as either data cables or phone cables. The extent of the damage has been ascertained, but I've not seen any kind of absolute confirmation on this. We know that the Swedes certainly have had some units down there using uncrewed platforms to go and investigate what's been going on. Pretty rapidly thereafter, a Chinese bulk carrier has been sort of flagged as being a vessel of interest. You may remember that there was an incident in the Baltic, must have been last year, I guess, and eventually a Chinese vessel was effectively called out as having caused the damage through dragging its anchor. I think it was called the new polar bear, if memory serves me rightly. But in this case, it's a bulk carrier called the Yipeng 3. And she was boarded on the night of the 19th of November in, I think it's looks like she's somewhere near the vicinity of the Great Belt, so sort of the area between Denmark and Sweden. And she is still at anchor there, surrounded by Coast Guard or naval vessels from Sweden, Denmark, and Germany. So it's pretty clear that those Baltic states believe that there's been something, whether it's been foul play or not, is a bit difficult to tell, but that's certainly the implication. Now, quite why, where, what is still a bit unclear. The vessel was sailing from a Russian port, which, given concerns sort of European security and Russia at the moment, there may be something in that. But it's another incident in this sort of line of incidents in terms of undersea infrastructure in the Baltic. But it's also this question around how do you protect something in this kind of way against what is a very basic kind of form of potential damage, right? Dragging an anchor is not a complicated thing. So there's lots and lots of questions from attribution through to kind of how you actually try and defend against this type of attack. But it seems to be something that's here to stay.
It does, and I think that we need to obviously situate it in the wider context of attacks that appear to have been occurring in Europe, whether that's fires in factories, attempted assassinations, etc. And we did talk a couple of weeks ago about the fire at the UK nuclear submarine yard in Barrow-in-Furness. And we don't know still any information about what caused that whatsoever, but there is this what looks like a campaign of Russian sabotage occurring across Europe. There has been a significant focus on, for want of a better term, Russian task forces investigating maritime infrastructure within the Baltic. And so this kind of links in with that. The interesting reporting, I mean, there have been foreign ministers from some of the countries involved who have been quite clear in blaming Russia. The US have come out and said they're not quite clear what has happened on it. But certainly I think it just goes back to highlight that vulnerability, which links back to our conversation, not to keep selling a Coastguard. I call it Jen Parker's Coastguard. But it links back to that conversation about what are the maritime threats, how are they broadening, although this isn't new. And in the Did You Know, we're going to talk about attacks on subsea cables because this isn't new. It's just something that we haven't looked at in a long time. And the dependencies now on subsea cables are much greater than they arguably were when they were targets during the World Wars. But look, I think that, we'll wait and see what comes out of it. I'm not sure we'll get any more information, but I think it just makes us need to think about how is Australia dealing with subsea cable protection. At the terminals, it's very clear that's an AFP responsibility, but on the seabed, that is much more challenging. And it does require significant issues to do with design and developing in resilience to some of those cables, but also surveillance. And that's not a capability, certainly in the public sphere, that we appear to have. A good piece, just a shout out in The Australian on Friday, 22nd November, from Anthony Bergen and Sam Bashfield, really talking about some of the concerns from an Australian perspective for this. So I think this is just a growing or a re-emerging sphere of seabed warfare that has the potential to have a much greater impact now because of dependencies on the internet.
Yeah, and I think the other point is that traditionally this has been, certainly in terms of damage rather than tapping of these kind of cables, this has been a wartime activity. And what's really interesting and what's truly novel about this is the degree to which this is becoming a kind of, are we peacetime, but an activity which is taking place below the kind of threshold, which in certain regards makes it more difficult to try and respond to. So you can't stop ships from sailing across international waters. So it becomes very difficult then to do anything in terms of protecting some of these cables. So lots and lots of challenges.
Do you know, actually, and I wish I'd researched it for this, and I haven't, and I'm going to embarrass myself, and hopefully Douglas Guilfoyle is listening and he can correct the record on this. But actually, I had this debate earlier this year with a maritime lawyer. There is actually some age-old international law on boarding operations that you can conduct against vessels that you suspect to be interfering with subsea cables beyond the exclusive economic zone. Is kind of like piracy, except for the fact it's not as widely as accepted. But maybe we'll see a resurgence in terms of discussion around that. I think that's an 1890s treaty or something like that. Douglas, please help us. 1884.
If it's the one, I think it is. The trouble is that it's a post-fact thing. But it'd be really interesting to know under what, if this Chinese vessel has been detained, under what kind of legislation. And anyway, we're getting properly into the weeds here. We ought to de-geekify.
We are.
Do you want to talk about what else has been going on?
Yeah, look, so I think there were some interesting comments from Admiral Paparo last week at a Brookings Institute conference or similar, talking about uncrewed capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. And I guess it's the reason I flag it is we've had a lot of discussion, certainly debate in Australia, about uncrewed capabilities replacing submarines, uncrewed capabilities replacing surface ships, and the need to move away from some of these conventional capabilities. And we've spoken a lot on it. I've written a lot on why I think a lot of this is farcical. Not that I'm not embracing the uncrewed evolution, not revolution. I am, but I don't see it as replacing some of these capabilities. And I won't go into why here. But the statement from Admiral Paparo last week seemed to express to me, I guess, a degree of frustration around this view that uncrewed capabilities and increasing the fleet through uncrewed capabilities was going to solve the problems of the vast distances of the Indo-Pacific. And we've heard about the Hellscape concept in terms of the defense of the Taiwan Strait. And so I thought it was interesting in terms of him kind of pushing back on this, saying, well, given the distances of the, paraphrasing, but given the distances of the Indo-Pacific, given the nature of potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific, uncrewed underwater vehicles and uncrewed surface vehicles are not going to solve these problems. And so I thought that was kind of the first, honestly, naval leader that I've seen come out from any country that's really kind of said, yeah, these things matter, but they're not the be-all and end-all. They're not solving all of our problems. And I think it was just a really important contribution to the debate, because I think often some of the hype around that, and they are really important capabilities, right? And we need to work out where they fit in. But it sometimes takes on a life of its own. So I thought they were important. Some of his statements said, you're going to have to sustain those forces in Japan over wide-ranging space. You're going to need air and maritime superiority, basically implying that uncrewed capabilities aren't going to provide that. What were your take on his comments?
I mean, I think he's preaching to the choir amongst us what little we know, but that's certainly very much the line that I would take. And I think there's been a lot of discussion, particularly coming out of the Black Sea, and the amazing way that the Ukrainians have managed to contest and deny the Russians kind of command of the sea in the Black Sea, using these kind of relatively small, attritable USVs, but somehow suggesting that the Black Sea and the Pacific are similar, or that Russia and China are similar. I think that people can perhaps over-egg or take draw lessons which are not entirely accurate from it, and I think that's very much the line that's being taken here. What I think is interesting, coming back to your point about sort of not hearing this from other naval officers, I think perhaps this is because he is very much in a kind of more operational focused command, rather than some of the people who love to suggest that these are going to be magic bullets which solve all of the problems, which tend to be comments coming from those who are perhaps more politically focused, but maybe that's me reading too much into this. I'm certainly always surprised when people suddenly start saying, uncrewed numbers are going to get the US Navy surface fleet up to 600 vessels, or whatever the number they pluck from the air happens to be. I just don't buy it, certainly not in the short to medium term.
Look, I agree, and I'm smiling, and I won't go into it because it's not for an unclassified podcast, except to say I do have some experience in trying to integrate these capabilities into operations. And yes, often overstated in terms of their roles. But moving on to another area. In fact, the US has recently gifted some, I think they're called Mantis 12, kind of USV, uncrewed surface vessel, fast intercept boats to the Philippines, which appears now to have been part of a wider kind of effort with the Philippines, which is taken the form of Task Force-Ayungin. What are your thoughts on Task Force-Ayungin? We don't seem to know a lot about what this task force is.
So yeah, the comments that I've seen from the Philippines seem to suggest this is very much focused on kind of coordination and an element of maritime domain awareness and ISR. But there's also sort of comments suggesting that it's more broad, talking about enhancing alliance coordination and interoperability and sort of US support. So it seems quite clear that the Americans are ramping up their efforts to support the Philippines, and we've seen this and we've talked about this before on this podcast. But I guess this is perhaps a more permanent and more sort of structured element of that, and seeing American kind of capabilities being integrated a little bit more into the sort of Philippine system. In terms of the ISR side of things, I think that might be quite interesting, particularly because there'll obviously be challenges in sharing some of that kind of information So actually having greater integration might ease a little bit of that. And the USV side of things, again, I think is interesting. We talked about this before about the setting up of the Philippine task force. I can see clear scope for this in the South China Sea. I can also see some significant kind of operational challenges. What happens when these things start being deployed near Chinese Coastguard or Chinese maritime militia assets? How do these dynamics play out? I think there's some very interesting kind of questions there. But it certainly fits into a wider pattern. And again, I think it's also interesting that it was made very much kind of public. Quite a lot of not press, but very much this is something that the Americans wanted to put out there and signal. So there's clearly that side of it as well.
Yeah, and it seems to be something that the Americans want to put out there and signal, but the Philippines didn't want to signal so much. And I think there's been, a lot of kind of pushback from the Philippines saying, we do our resupply missions independently. Of course, they have surveillance support from the US. Look, I think it's a prudent way of coordinating support, whether that's surveillance support, whether that's training support, whether it's just key points of communication. Right? I think it's prudent. I think it's important. I'm not sure we're at the point where we'd want to see it go too much further in terms of forward leaning. I think that could be escalatory, although there is a theory that to solve issues in the South China Sea, you're going to have to escalate to de-escalate. I'm not quite there yet, to be honest. And I think it's an interesting question about, and I think we talked about this with the Philippines task force that they've stood up for the operation of USVs in the South China Sea. There is just this threshold question about what happens when you introduce this new capability into the environment and how does it change things. And we have some precedent for this. Certainly, we saw the 2015 interception of a US wave glider in, I think, I'm going to say the South China Sea. It might have been East Asia, but South China Sea by the Chinese and how that was dealt with. We saw the Iranian interceptions of 2 sail drones in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and how that was dealt with. And I think there is just this unclear air about if this happens, how is this vessel classified and what responses might the country go to get it back. So I think that's always dangerous. But eventually we're going to have to work through that. So maybe you're going to do it first in South China Sea.
Yeah, of all places. I also
what could
think
go wrong?
It's interesting it being potentially Philippine rather than American. Again, how those dynamics play out is again interesting, and the more confusion and uncertainty about even things like ownership and whose bit of kit is this, I think adds potential further layers of complexity into that and potential issues. Anyway, we won't talk about and dwell on potential problems. I'm sure if they crop up, we'll end up having to talk about them anyway. Moving on, talking about capability.
I thought you were saying current problems, because there's current problems. Look, lots have been happening in capability. Not quite the Indo-Pacific, but I think it's relevant. So why don't we first start, given your country of birth, you want to start with cuts to the Royal Navy that have come out?
Yes, so this is sort of both a non-story and a story in the regard that there have been announced some quite significant cuts to the sort of Royal Navy's force structure on paper anyway. So 2 of the amphibious assault ships, HMS Albion, HMS Albion. I'm obviously acclimatizing too much now, aren't I? HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark are going to be decommissioned by 2025. The repairs to the Type 23 frigate HMS Northumberland are not going to be carried out. They're considered to be uneconomical. And 2 tankers, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Wave Knight and Wave Ruler, will also be decommissioned. This sounds like a lot, and in certain regards is a lot. However, none of these vessels were realistically in service in any meaningful way. Put bluntly, they can't at the moment crew them. They were in kind of long-term reserve. So this is not a significant cut in that regard, and that the plan, at least, or the stated plan, is that neither Albion nor Bulwark, which is the main focus of much of the discussion here, were planned to effectively go back onto operations before they were going to be decommissioned anyway. So that the claim is coming from the new Labour government is that this is actually not having much impact. And I think probably that's fair, but that then in and of itself speaks to a much bigger problem, which is that ultimately the UK Armed Forces is in a real difficult position, particularly in terms of personnel, but not only in terms of personnel. So the issues with the Type 23s, for example, basically they've just been trying to push these hulls out for far longer than they really had in them. And the Type 26s, which is the same as the Hunter class, or similar design to the Hunter class in Australia, have not come on stream fast enough. And so they're having to eke out more years from hulls that simply don't have it in them. The personnel issues, both in terms of Albion and the two tankers, these are well-known problems, and the fleet auxiliary in particular is in a horrendous state, at least in part because of a lack of people. So both a non-story and a significant story, and I think for all of the kind of good news, flashy elements of new kit that the British Armed Forces is hoping to develop and hoping to acquire, they're in for a pretty rough period, and this, I think, might only be the start of that.
Yeah, look, I agree. I had the pleasure of serving as the head of the warfare department on a Type 23, the great ship HMS Lancaster. It was, until the Queen passed away, it was the Queen's frigate, and that was 10 years ago, and it was incredibly old and not in a great state. So I can only imagine where some of these Type 23s are now. And I think that there's this real conversation about what is the point of keeping capability that you're not going to be able to use, versus how much of a drain that's putting on the budget. And this is the same conversation about the Anzac class in Australia and the decommissioning of HMAS Anzac, which was quite polarising for many, but also I think really just a financial conversation about the status of that vessel, the age of that vessel, and the cost of that vessel. So, potentially these are just being realistic about what the actual capability is, rather than having capabilities on paper that don't exist. Interestingly, it has coincided with some calls from the Chief of Defence Staff in the UK, Sir Tony Radican, talking about the fact that the UK should be preparing for conflict in the same way that the Swedes and some of the Baltic states have been talking about doing so. And as much as that sounds grim, given Putin's comments on Thursday that he would use intermediate missiles against countries who supplied missiles to Ukraine to strike Russian territory, there is a real heating up in the European theatre. So this is it's an awkward tension, because it looks like a reduction in capability, but it's not really a reduction in capability. It's probably an acknowledgement of what the actual capabilities are. So, with some resonating in terms of Australian aged capabilities.
Absolutely. And the challenges created by decisions to kick cans down roads 10 years or so ago. Anyway, we heard more about the C3000 down select.
Yes, well, I mean, we had it confirmed.
Yeah.
So certainly, we talked about this an episode or two ago. That they're all blurring. That's because they're so good. That's why they're blurring. But we have seen reporting from Defence today that the government has made a down select of the C3000, so the future frigate for Australia, to Japan and to Germany. So some people have pointed out it's not quite clear which versions or designs, because there is some controversy about which version or design we're actually looking at. For controversy, I don't know if it's that controversial, but for Japan. But look, yes, we've had that confirmed. And I think the good thing about it is there was some reporting a couple of weeks ago that this down select may not actually occur until 2025, which, timeframes are pretty critical here. There are 10 surface combatants in the Royal Australian Navy's fleet. That's more frigates than the Royal Navy currently has, although not surface combatants. I'm being a bit tricky with numbers, but still, it'll go down to 9 in 2026. The only hope to start lifting this up is to actually get this C3000 on time, maybe even ahead of time. I think there are actually some options to do that, but don't quote me on that. And so it is important that the down select occurs. I still am a bit surprised. And again, I do think the current government has pushed this through very quickly from the February announcement, but I'm still a bit surprised given the terms of reference for the DSR were written late 2022. I still don't understand why the DSR could not have dealt with this problem, and why 2 years on from those terms of reference, we're still at a down select to 2 competitors, having to now get a selection, hopefully before an Australian election next year. Otherwise, who knows what happens. So I still think time is not as fast as it could have been on this one. What are your comments? What are your thoughts?
Oh, nothing particularly. I mean, I think we'll just have to wait and see. And I think that we're in that niche world where there is controversy over which designs we're talking about. But that's because we operate in a very, very niche world. Talking of things which are progressing relatively quickly, certainly more quickly than was initially planned, and that's the Army landing craft or watercraft. So we heard again earlier this week that the selection, the preferred option from Damon Shipyards, which is their LST-100 design, has been selected for the landing craft heavy. This is the larger of the sort of 2 Australian Army landing craft that are being built. We've already heard the options for the landing craft medium. So this was the landing craft heavy. This is it's a nearly 4,000 ton vessel, about 100 meters long, so a very substantial kind of vessel. It's going to be built by Austal in Western Australia, and the construction is supposed to start in 2026 with, I think, off the top of my head, delivery in first delivery in 2028. And the landing craft mediums are supposed to be coming in before then. So this is all happening pretty quickly, and is something that has been accelerated, I think, because of the need to get this capability over the line, and also because of some interesting dynamics in terms of shipbuilding. But interesting to see this taking place, and there's a pretty clear focus on getting some considerable maritime capability into the Australian Army.
There is, and I think this is something that's probably an example of some fairly quick decision making, although depending on where you think the starting mark is, because the Force Structure Plan in 2020 actually announced its capabilities. But there was a lot of debate about whether that would actually happen or not, and whether they were funded or not. So I think this is good. It's not surprising. Certainly, it's going to be a great ramp up for shipbuilding in WA to then go on and produce the general purpose frigate, which I think, when you think about it in terms of that ramp up, I think that's a really neat way to approach it. And I think whoever came up with that idea, that's well done to them. It certainly will put WA in a better position to be producing the general purpose frigates. Although there has been some commentary, I don't know how verified, that they may not be producing 8 of them. It's more than 3 might be produced offshore, but who knows? That's not written or verified anyway. That's just commentary. So yeah, look, I think positive. I'm still not exactly sure where these capabilities fit in the concept of operations versus the LHDs, what that mix is, how they're going to be protected, how they're going to be crewed, or who's going to be responsible for crewing them. I do struggle to see the Australian Army despite their best efforts, being in a position to crew these things themselves. And I'm not actually sure that is necessarily a prudent approach with the heavies, given the amount of mariners they would need to create career structures for. But that's just some of my concerns. But we'll see where we get to.
And other than that, in capability?
Oh yeah, more Australian shipbuilding success. I like picking up the Australian shipbuilding industry because I actually think it has more potential than people give it credit for. It doesn't necessarily have the investments always needed. But we saw another Guardian class patrol boat given to Fiji on Friday. Now we won't go into the history of what's happened previously, but I do want to give it a plug because I think the Australian building of the Guardian class patrol boat has happened in the evolved Cape class quite quickly, and as far as I'm aware, with relatively little issues or drama. I mean, there's always going to be issues with these capabilities, right? There is, but and I think the Pacific Maritime Support Program, I think it's called now, the old Pacific Patrol Boat Program, is something that Australia does not sing the praises of enough. I think it's something that has been a really good contribution to capabilities across the Pacific. Could it be better? Sure, but how long's a piece of string? So I just think it's important to highlight that another Guardian class has been provided to Fiji.
Excellent. And as you say, I think that the program certainly has its strengths, both in terms of delivering results and also in terms of the kind of diplomatic and personnel and other connections that are developed across the region. So it's broadly speaking, I think a pretty good news story. Anyway, we're coming towards the end, but as we are back on the Did You Know train, it's your go this week.
Right, well, we are back on the Did You Know train because we have been effectively called out for being lazy.
Never.
No, certainly not by our sponsors because we have none. This Did You Know kind of released that kind of conversation around subsea cables and seabed warfare. And so it's a Did You Know about the first subsea cables to be attacked. So did you know that the first recorded attack on a subsea cable happened during the Crimean War in 1854, which now we think about it probably prompted some of that body of international treaties that were developed in the late 19th century around vessels damaging subsea cables. What actually happened in the Crimean War? British forces cut the undersea telegraph cable linking Sevastopol, Russia, to Varna, Bulgaria, across the Black Sea, obviously a sea that we're all very familiar with now. This act disrupted Russian communications and marked the first instance of deliberate subsea cable sabotage during wartime. Even in the mid-19th century, undersea cables were recognised as critical infrastructure and their vulnerability became a strategic consideration in conflict, which is why it's so surprising we seem to be so surprised by these developments. When you get forward to the World Wars, we saw subsea cable attacks become a familiar feature of naval operations. During World War I, the British Navy cut 5 German undersea telegraph cables on the very first day of World War I. This forced German communications to route through cables Britain could intercept, giving the Allies a significant intelligence advantage, most famously enabling the inception of the Zimmermann telegram, which contributed to the US entering the war. In World War II, subsea cables remained critical targets, though their military value had shifted with the rise of wireless communications. Despite this, both the Allies and Axis powers targeted cables to disrupt on or spy on enemy communications. In a notable incident, the Allies tapped into Japanese subsea cables to gather intelligence, showcasing the enduring strategic importance of cable networks. And that's a whole long story that maybe we'll go into in different Did You Know, but we are up against time. So all I will kind of really highlight now is the idea of seabed warfare and targeting subsea cables is not new. It's something we should expect. Maybe in a period of peacetime that's new, but I think it's arguable whether Europe is in a period of peacetime right now. And so really we do need to be looking at our ability to strengthen that. And part of that is about resilience, so not being dependent on single cables, which some of the Pacific Islands are. Some of that is about maritime domain awareness, and this is not just me wanting to plug that I'm writing an encyclopedia entry that you'll all be excited to read about what is maritime domain awareness, but some of that is also having the capabilities to be able to survey these cables and repair them in a quick time frame, all of which we have problems with when it comes to Australia, but also most countries across the world. They're known problems. Anyway, did you know subsea cables, Crimean War, 1854?
Now, that bit, I did vaguely know, but I'd forgotten.
Oh, that's depressing.
But the rest of it, I think, is fascinating. And we talk too much about these kind of things as if the world suddenly got invented in about 2020 and all of these challenges are new, when in fact they're different, but not always entirely new. But I guess the point which we can take from 1854 onwards, or maybe even well beyond that is that maritime mattered then and it matters now. And on that note, that corny note, I'm going to end the podcast. Thanks as ever, Jen. Good to chat.
Thanks, Richard.